Good afternoon, Tom. As you know, we gather questions from emails and different sources like that from Patreon subscribers and things. Today, I had a look through the recent clips we did on the first QSEC symposium, where we have three clips. One is your introduction, David Chartrand's presentation, and your Q&A, you and David, with your closing remarks. So I took some of the comments, and they've really been very good. Took some of the comments and looked through them to see whether you could comment on some of the comments. One of them is, I do appreciate your ideas, especially that love is the most fundamental, but I just can't get past the assumption of free will. I think high achievers especially struggle with this belief. Now, I know that in your theory, consciousness, free will, and time are essential. So could you comment on that comment?
Sure, I'd be glad to comment on that comment. I don't know about high achievers, but I do know that materialists, physicists in particular, have a real difficult time with the concept of free will. Because to be a materialist, you also have to be a determinist. And a determinist believes that nothing can change. Everything just is. And it's always meant to be that way. And there is no learning, there's no evolution, there's no change. We're like characters in a movie that's already been shot and printed. The movie's over. Now you look at a character in the movie and you say, oh, he could fight or he could run away. But no, he has to do whatever he did when the cameras were rolling. He can no longer make a choice. And that's the way scientists in general see our life. Like we're characters in a movie that's already been shot and printed, and we no longer can make any changes. We just have to do what's predestined for us to do. It's also called predestination. It's a determinism. And if you're a materialist, then you have to be a determinist or you'll be inconsistent with your logic. So the physicists particularly think that if they had all the information in the universe, how every particle was moving and what it was doing and how it was configured and so on, they could predict everything else from there on to the end of time. They could predict it all. Well, that's just wrong. The world does not work that way. Now, a materialist believes that material is at the bottom of reality. If you look, dig a hole down into reality, what you're going to find is matter. Matter is what is fundamental. And this reality is a reality based on matter. Well, their own science of quantum physics has already told them that that is not true. When you dig down to the bottom, what you find is probability, not matter. And that has thrown them for a loop now for 100 years, and they still haven't yet figured out, what the right answer is. But when you have that opinion of materialism and determinism, then to be logically consistent, you must also say that not only is free will an illusion and doesn't exist, but consciousness is an illusion and doesn't exist, and time is an illusion and doesn't really exist. Well, that's kind of hard to do since all of us make choices. We learn, we grow, we evolve. We make choices that change things, change them for ourselves, change it for others. So we live every day in a world where consciousness is a thing. We're conscious, and where time is a thing. Time comes and time goes, and we're older now than we were then, and we made a lot of decisions on the way. So it's just obvious to anybody who has their eyes open that there is time and consciousness and free will. And all of these things are real, they're not illusions. So physicists have gone to some extreme means to try to explain how this illusion works. The many worlds is one of such of these extreme things that really doesn't make any sense. But they say, well, the illusion of time is that you jump from reality to reality to reality. It just seems to be that time's moving, but all these realities are fixed. They're all the realities that show everything that could possibly happen. and you just jump through them and you think there's time. But you see, there's a logical problem there. If there is no time, how do you jump from one reality to another? To jump requires time. I was here, now I'm there. I've changed positions. I'm now in a different reality frame. So that takes time. Was in this one, now in that one, now in the next one. So in other words, you have to allow time as a real thing before you can justify that there is no time. That's a logical problem. Okay. So anyway, that's where this problem comes from. That's why this person just can't seem to get it. And he thinks that a certain group of people have a problem, but that group of people are people who have been grown up in a culture that believes that materialism is fundamental and therefore that there is no free will. And teachers don't teach people things like that. You just get it from your culture. It's part of just what is assumed to be true. So that's the problem. Now, from my viewpoint, when you dig down into reality, you don't end up with matter. You end up with consciousness. And it's consciousness that produces the virtual reality. And it does that as a statistical and probabilistic reality, because that's millions of times more efficient than a bottoms-up calculate, starting with all the subatomic particles to atomic particles to molecules. If you start at the bottom and work up, the problem is intractable. It's silly. It's sort of like many worlds. It's just not a practical thing to even think about. So instead, you do a statistics and probability-based reality. Now, that seems a little chancy, because when we do probability-based realities, mostly they're not all that accurate, because we don't have the probability distributions that describe reality. We don't have all those precisely. It's very hard to measure them. It's hard to get them. So when we do probability-based simulations, we mostly make up the probability distributions. Oh, we'll say that all the distributions are Gaussian. They're all normal distributions. Well, that's not true. They're not. So then those simulations seem like, well, they're not as good as the bottoms-up simulations because they have all these assumptions. So the statistics and probability-based models kind of have this Achilles heel. They don't have the real probability distributions. However, at a virtual reality, everything is rendered. Everything is calculated. The whole reality comes out of a computer. Everything that exists there is rendered there. So if the humans make a cannon out of iron and they make it in a certain way and they cast it in a certain way, well, what's happening is they are being rendered, making this, making the material, coming up with the iron, mining the ore. Every piece of it is there. And then when the cannon fires, that's just another simulation. Okay, the system has to render that cannon being fired. Well, how does it do that? Well, it knows all the details because it's rendered everything. Every piece of reality was rendered, so it knows every detail. And it works with a rule set. This virtual reality has evolved from a rule set and a set of initial conditions. That's the big digital bang. Okay, so it's in a computer. So every single probability distribution describing how this reality works is known in every detail. So in this case, the system has everything it needs to very precisely use probability to determine what happens next, rather than from the bottom up determining what happens next, like physicists believe. You see, so that makes it, understandable why in quantum physics you end up with probability, because a probability-based model is, like I say, 1,000,000 times more efficient, particularly if you have all those probability distributions exactly. So you can do it as, to 20 decimal places if you want, or 100 decimal places if you want. You see, it's all there and as exact as it gets. So given the fact that everybody, perhaps except physicists, realize that they evolve, they grow, they learn. They weren't born with that advanced knowledge of physics. They had to learn that. Well, learning it's impossible if you have no time and everything's deterministic. So somehow they come up with schemes to allow them to create change and to create time. And those are very far-fetched and they don't actually work that way. Fundamentally, you have consciousness. Consciousness creates this physical universe, what we call the physical universe, and it's really a virtual reality. Now, consciousness evolves like anything else evolves by making changes. Changes are real. And consciousness particularly evolves by lowering its entropy, getting rid of randomness, creating order. Now, it's not just order by putting all the little pegs in a row. That's very minor amount of lowering entropy, but it's lowering its entropy by creating information that's useful and meaningful and significant and helpful. When it creates that kind of information that's useful, then that lowers the entropy of the system, which otherwise has random bits in it. You see? So if you have a model based on consciousness, then you also have to have a model based on time. Why? Because consciousness makes choices. That's what it does. Before the choice, after the choice, time, things change, things evolve. And you also have to have free will because that defines a choice. If there is no free will, there are no choices. Everything's just static. So if you go with determinism, you'd say, well, if consciousness is fundamental, then you have determinism and nothing else happens. Consciousness just exists and does nothing. Well, that isn't what we experience. So the idea is you need to let go of your innate internal sense of materialism and determinism and realize that you just learned that because you grew up in a Western culture. And that's just part of Western culture. That's a belief. It's not a fact. And physics has based itself on that belief for a long time. And Newtonian physics used that belief and did some wonderful things. But they were limited. They could only do so much within the context of that belief. When things started going too fast or got too small, they couldn't get the right answers. So quantum physics came along, relativity came along, and now we can understand those other areas where Newtonian physics just didn't work anymore. And we had experiments that showed us over and over and over again that at the root, reality is information-based. And most physicists who deal in quantum theory and particle physicists will tell you that reality is information-based. It's all about information. And guess what? Consciousness can best be modeled as an information system. It's all about information. It gets input, right? It takes that input, processes that input. It then acts on that input. It has memory, so it can tell some new input from an old input and put together a story of what it wants to do next with its understanding it gets from the processing. So what do we know? That takes in data, processes data, has memory, and then decides on an output? Well, that's a computer. So consciousness can best be modeled as a information system. And reality is all about information, as the physicists tell us. So that consciousness is fundamental is not really a big logical leap in that case. So if you realize that quantum physics is not just weird science that can't be explained, it's exactly the way the world works. At the base is probability. That's the nature of existence, and that is the most efficient way to produce this physical universe that is nothing other than a virtual reality. So with that understanding, then free will is not only a thing, it's a fundamental thing. It's basic. It's a basic part of the logic of existence. Now, I know if you're a believer in materialism and you're a believer, in determinism, you just can't get there because believers, well, let's put it this way, belief is non-rational. Belief is always non-rational. You just believe it. And if you're in Western culture, you grew up believing that physical reality is physical and that matter is at the base of it. So whether you formally were taught that or whether you just absorbed it and you're a believer, that's why you have trouble grokking free will, because somewhere deep inside, that just has to be impossible. And time has to be impossible too. And that confuses the heck out of you because you can't imagine that because everything changes and moves on time. And then you have to realize that, oh, there's no changes. Nothing changes. You're like a movie that's already been filmed and printed. Nothing ever changes. You just act out your part exactly the way you have to, and nothing else happens. You can't learn, you can't evolve, you can't grow, you can't become, you can't do anything. There are no choices. Well, where does that leave you? It leaves you nowhere. You're nothing. You're absolutely nothing, doing nothing, feeling nothing, thinking nothing. You are an illusion. Like the characters in a movie, they're illusions. Those aren't real people that are up there on that screen. Those are just illusions of people. Well, that's what you are then. You're nothing. You're just an illusion of a human being. Now, let's go full circle with that. This is a virtual reality. And guess what? Human beings in a virtual reality, or elves in the World of Warcraft, whatever you want to say, or people in The Sims, are just an illusion. There's not really little people in there wandering around in The Sims. That's just an illusion of people. So you see, we get back to this idea of illusion at the root. Well, it's at the root of a virtual reality, not at the root of an actual reality. Okay, so yes, indeed, this world and all the people in it and all the things are an illusion. But that's because it's a virtual reality. In the real reality and what matters, in the fundamental stuff, time, free will, and consciousness are a thing. That's what makes it real. Information is real. Nothing gets more real than information. So that's the problem here, is belief. And belief is not rational. Believers believe that their beliefs are facts. That's just the notion of belief. Anybody who believes anything, no matter how ridiculous it is, if they believe that the moon is really made out of green cheese, then if they believe that, then that is a fact in their mind. That moon is made out of green cheese, and that's a fact to them. So if you are a materialist, that determinism is a fact to you. Materialism is a fact, even though science says it's wrong, because they dig down into small particles and the littler stuff at the bottom, which is where the physical reality has to start, is down with the smallest particles, and they find it's just probability. So anyway, that is probably a very long dissertation on why people believe that there can't be any free will. It's just
And a
an
very good
ingrained
one.
belief. Yeah.
You
And
unfolded that really well.
yeah, and to argue with such a person is totally useless because it doesn't come from any intellectual knowledge or any experience. In fact, experience will tell them that time is a thing because they're getting older and they see a lot of things change and that consciousness is there. They feel like they're conscious. So experience tells you just the opposite. Experience tells you that time, consciousness, and choice all exist.
Well, I
And
think your logical
yeah,
minded audience greatly appreciate this very detailed explanation.
probably overdid that, but
No,
it's a problem
no,
that keeps coming
that's
up
really
over and over
good.
and over again. So I thought I'd pay a little
Yeah,
attention to it and see if we couldn't
yeah,
tell them it's just a belief.
it was a wonderful unfolding. So thanks very much, Tom, for that detailed explanation.
Uh, you're welcome.
You have more power than you think. Hi, this is Donna from MBT Events. I have had the privilege to work with Tom Campbell for nearly 20 years now, and I can tell you from the feedback received through all those years that he has improved and changed thousands of lives with his My Big Toe theory. As a physicist and explorer of the larger reality, Tom has developed a program where you can learn to access and develop your natural ability as consciousness. His expertly crafted binaural beats are included. Details are in the description below. Thank you.
I and MBT Events hope you like this video. If you do, then you should consider being a Patreon member, because Patreon members get early access to our special content. You will also be able to get your questions answered by me in special Q&A sessions, and most importantly, your contribution as a patron member will enable us to produce the content that you're looking for. So thank you.